But first, Prime Minister Trudeau says we have to rebuild better after floods across the country. But what if you know it's just a matter of time before the high waters return? Residents in British Columbia's Central Okanagan district who have been dealing with floodwaters got a reprieve over the weekend when heavy showers that had been predicted failed to materialize.
We still have lots of water. We're not finished yet. Well, I got some sleep last night. I feel better now. Yeah, the water levels have gone down about 3 inches in here.
Kelowna resident Jerry Gilkinson speaking to CBC News. Water levels did not rise as much as expected. In some cases, they even went down, and many evacuation alerts and orders were rescinded. But officials say more rainfall and melting snow could still pose a risk of further flooding in the area. And they are advising residents to keep sandbags in place for now. Kelowna Mayor Colin Basran said yesterday the situation is still volatile.
What the situation is right now in our city is that with high lake levels and creek levels, there's just really no more room for any more water. And so we've dodged a bullet over the past few days, but we're still in a very volatile situation. If the weather changes and we do get a bit of increased precipitation, it's certainly going to have an impact. And so we're asking our residents to still be vigilant. And those living in low-lying areas next to bodies of water, we're asking that they still be ready to leave on a moment's notice.
Kelowna Mayor Colin Basran. Meanwhile, in Quebec and Ontario, thoughts are turning to what comes next when the waters recede. It will cost millions of dollars to clean up and rebuild the many businesses and homes ravaged by floods. And many are questioning how that money should be spent and even if that reconstruction should be done. Last week, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, added his voice to those calling for a more thoughtful approach to rebuilding.
One of the things that we are aware of is that the frequency of extreme weather events is increasing, and that's related to climate change. So we're going to have to understand that bracing for a 100-year storm is maybe going to happen every 10 years now or every few years. And that means that as we look to rebuild our communities, our homes, our infrastructures, we're going to have to think about what we can do to rebuild better, to rebuild in ways that are going to be more resistant, more resilient to the unpredictability we are now living. And that's something that we know that it might be more expensive to rebuild better now, but that'll certainly be less expensive than the cleanup and the disaster response that is going to increasingly have to happen if extreme weather events keep going the way they are.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Well, I'm joined by three experts who thought about how or even if we should rebuild better. Jeannine St-Jacques is a climatologist and a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia University in Montreal. She's in our Quebec City studio. Glenn McGillivray is Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. He's in our Toronto studio. Steve Conrad is Adjunct Professor at the University of BC and a board member of the BC Water and Waste Association. He's also an engineer with a background in psychology, and he's in our Vancouver studio. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna Maria.
Hello.
Good morning.
Hi, everybody. Steve Conrad, I'm going to start with you in Vancouver. Prime Minister Trudeau says we have to build better. What have we been getting wrong when it comes to rebuilding after a major flood?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is think a little bit about what Justin Trudeau was mentioning in terms of how we actually do design and build our communities. Historically, what we have done is design communities based upon an average rainfall, an average sea level, an average river flow. But with climate change, we're starting to see that these averages are more, they fluctuate over time. And so what we need to do is design communities that can appreciate those differences. You know, if we look at British Columbia, just the weather over the last few years, you know, in 2015, we were talking about drought. 2016, we had weeks of snow in Vancouver, and now we're talking about flooding. So, you know, if I was to sum it up in a few words, you might say the BC weather has really shown us to appreciate the unforeseeable. And in appreciating that unforeseeable, it means that communities should plan for events that are outside these historical norms that we have typically used to design our communities. So what that might mean for communities, well, perhaps we need to consider ways to reduce the impact of storms by slowing that water down, slowing the storm water that goes through our communities through rain gardens, through green roofs, using different types of building materials that are more porous. So rather than these concrete and steel structures, we can use materials that absorb that water and slow down that water.
Okay, so I'll get some more ideas from you in a moment, but what you're saying is we've got some of this wrong so far.
I think well, it's not so much that we've had it wrong, but I think we need to appreciate that we need to do it definitely different, and what we've based our historical averages on are no longer true.
And Jeannine St-Jacques, when we talk about building better and when it comes to rebuilding homes and communities, should we rebuild everything? Is there a process we should have to determine what gets rebuilt and what doesn't?
Absolutely not. We've been building on the floodplains for years, which is insane, to be honest. Quebec has a problem in that it manages its water very poorly, and its flood management is also very poorly done. In the early 2000s, the province shifted the responsibility of water and flood management down to the municipality level by and large. Now, municipalities cannot deal with it. They're not set up to deal with it. They don't have the budget to deal with it. They don't have the expertise. It's been a disaster, as we see. And
why is that? What do municipalities do that, say, a province or a federal government wouldn't do? How do they see it?
Well, they don't have the expertise. They don't have the staff. They don't have the budgets.
So they're allowing development in areas that are flood prone.
Yes, they're in a conflict of interest situation, because if, everybody likes the waterfront view, everybody likes the river and the lake, if you allow building there, that's high value property. And then you get property taxes. And municipalities, of course, are desperate to be providing services, and they need that tax money. But then when the floods come, the damage is vast, the municipalities can't deal with paying for the floods. So and you can't manage a watershed at the municipality level. A watershed will contain many municipalities, and if municipality A does something to improve their lot in the next flood, that might make things worse for municipality B. So it has to be managed at the watershed level, and we're just not doing that right now.
Okay. Glenn McGillivray, when you look at what's going on, what do you think the best way to prevent flooding like this from happening again in the future would be?
Well, I think I tend to look at these things from kind of a risk management perspective, and risk management tells you that the best way to avoid a risk is just not to go there in the first place, just not to be there. So when it comes to flood, it means not building on a floodplain, and when we have had the flood, it means not rebuilding on the floodplain, particularly the immediate floodplain or the floodway. So we have to really think twice about putting things back, and the Prime Minister talked about Build Back Better. And one of the problems we have is just putting things back the way they were and crossing our fingers and hoping it doesn't happen again, and that's not going to be the case.
You talk about a mandatory buyout. What is that?
Well, this is where a government body would step in and offer fair market value for the property, so it's pre-flood fair market value. And then the land would be converted into green space or that sort of thing. And we saw it in the Toronto area after Hurricane Hazel in 1954, so 81 people around the Toronto area drowned in those floods. And the powers that be came in, bought out just around 200 homeowners in the Etobicoke area and a few other places, and around the Humber River and so on, converted that land into parkland and green space. And that land floods from time to time, and it did, just over a week ago when we had those torrential rains, parks flood, nobody's killed, no property is lost. And we've also seen it recently in Sydney, Nova Scotia, where the government's bought out 17 or 18 homeowners there as well. So mandatory is best. Voluntary programs do not work.
What happened in Calgary after their big floods?
Yeah, there was a voluntary program that was launched, and the homeowners were offered fair market value, and only about, I think, a third of the homeowners that were offered took the government up on the offer. That doesn't work. You get a few people, a few assets out of the floodplain, but you have the majority of people staying. It tears apart the fabric of that neighborhood. The neighborhood's not the same anymore, and you still have risk.
Jeannine St-Jacques, what do you think of what Glenn McGillivray is saying?
I think that's a very good idea. We've got to... The municipalities are allowing people to build in the floodplain. It has to go higher up. We need the province to be stepping in and saying, you can't build in the floodplain. There are watershed management organizations, but they've got a pathetic budget and they have no legal teeth. They say that. The other thing is in Quebec is we desperately need proper flood maps, flood recurrence maps covering the entire province. We don't have that.
Why not?
It's going back into some old history that I don't understand. But we don't have them. We need them. What we have is out of date. What we have is a situation, what it arises for is we don't have a proper organization inside the Ministry of Environment or Public Security that occupies itself with water and flood management, like, for instance, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan do, where I've been doing extensive consulting over the past decade. So what we have is a very tiny Centre d'Expertise Hydrique, which has, to the best of my knowledge, less than 10 people. They can't do it. They produce some flood maps, not many. For instance, Montreal, most of Montreal doesn't have proper updated flood maps. We need to be building up the Centre d'Expertise Hydrique or some other organization in public security, but we can't have the two fighting, because right now we have Centre d'Expertise producing the flood maps, and we have public security trying to deal with managing the urgent conditions.
So you're telling me that this is also a bureaucratic issue, that in other provinces
yes,
they deal with it differently, but they've downloaded it to municipalities that can't act alone.
Yes, very much.
Steve, Conrad, as we have that discussion, you also look at infrastructure. So when municipalities are building or rebuilding infrastructure, what do they have to think about when it comes to flooding?
Well, I guess there's really kind of two problems there with infrastructure. The first thing municipalities need to look at is replacing some of their aging infrastructure. And Canada's infrastructure card reported, just from a water and wastewater perspective, that we have $80 billion of needed infrastructure investment just to replace what's already there. And so municipalities, develop programs to go through and replace this existing infrastructure. But then they also need to determine, well, A, is it in a good place to begin with? B, is there an area for them to move it? Do they have a domain over that land where they can move their infrastructure, move critical services outside these high-risk areas? And then lastly, how are they going to pay for that additional investment when the way that infrastructure sort of is paid for is through a cost recovery? So how can municipalities really look to fund these new investments? And I would agree with the other speakers that local communities may need to get themselves sort of out of the business of investing into infrastructure development, just often because infrastructure is connected, and especially on a watershed.
Do you hear the conversations happening that you say need to happen, Steve? Well, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I would say on a very limited basis, yes, but not in a connected basis. So here in Metro Vancouver, we see within the city of Surrey conversations occurring about developing and adapting their infrastructure to mitigate effects like heat island effects, or to look in ways to improve stormwater management, but not so much on a regional basis. And so I think what we need is a regional plan at the minimum, and provincial plans for sure, and then federal support. So I've got a clip for you to listen to. One of the people planning to build better is a man named Alain Pitre of New Richmond, Quebec. He owns a sporting goods store not far from the Cascapedia River. It's the third time in 6 years that his business has been flooded. CBC Quebec's Marika Wheeler caught up with him. He was showing her dikes he built around his store after the last two floods. Listen to him.
What I've been through this weekend, I took some notes. Things going to change. The walls I have built are not strong enough. I will make them stronger and bigger. I went through internet. There's some things that you can buy, which is a water fence. Temporary, it's made of a rubber, whatever, that will rise with the water level going up and will go back down as the water level goes down, which you just put on for emergencies. Things like that will make me probably save my business and make me sleep better, because every time the forecast for big rain comes, I'm worried, I'm nervous.
Jeannine St-Jacques, what do you make of what he's saying there?
Well, he's trying to do something, which is good. But we have to accept that as global warming continues to bite, we're going to be seeing more and more extreme conditions. As the atmosphere warms, every degree of warming is 7% more water vapor in the air that can then potentially come out as rain. We're seeing changes in the jet stream. We're expecting, all of the models are predicting more and more droughts, more and more floods, more and more extreme whatever. So sometimes just staying in place it's just not going to work.
So what does that mean for planning, Jeannine, for people along parts of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway? What do you see?
Well, to begin with, I think we desperately have to get out of the 1 in 20 year flood zone. It's impractical. And I think it's going to have to take the province to step in saying that. And on one hand, we have the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, making very sense, saying we have to rebuild smarter. On the other hand, in Quebec, we're missing these flood maps. Philippe Couillard is saying we're going to help people rebuild in place. So I'm a bit pessimistic there. We've got an election year coming up.
People don't want to give up their homes. They like where they live. Is this part of the problem?
Oh, yeah, it's normal to be very attached. You put a lot of time and money and effort into a home. There's all the sentimentality. And somebody coming in like myself, a nasty hydroclimatologist, saying you can't build in the floodplain. I mean, I'm saying hard and cruel things. But if somebody else rebuilds, and I imagine they're going to have to put a lot of their own money into it, because, forgive me, but insurance, Glenn, never seems to cover replacement costs in anything that I know of. If somebody then rebuilds, and there's a good chance in their lifetime they're going to get flooded out again and have to start again, well, that seems even harder and crueler.
You have actually looked at the Gaspé area. What do you think of flooding, future flooding there, Jeannine?
Certainly their main problem is sea level rise. As you saw the destruction of the boardwalk at Percé, which I've walked on and is now splintered matchsticks. Gaspé is going to have to be retreating from that coastline. I wasn't aware till you played the clip that Cascapedia is rising that much, but it's an area of research that I'm certainly currently involved in, what river flows have been like in that area. So I think the Gaspé should be preparing for the worst, and I know the coastal road, I've driven it many a time, wraps around the coast very tightly. We may have to be thinking of moving that coastal road inland a bit. We're certainly going to have to be thinking about increasing the size of some of our culverts, and we desperately need that water expertise level at the provincial level advising people.
Glenn McGillivray, a few things. First of all, can I clarify, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, you work with insurance companies?
Yes, we do, yes.
You represent them through this institute, or?
From a scientific standpoint, we do research on behalf of the industry and on behalf of Canadians as a whole.
So if people decide to go ahead and rebuild homes and businesses in these flood zones where it's already flooded, what do they have to do? Because insurance doesn't cover them.
Well, flood insurance, overland flood insurance, is very new in Canada. It's only been around for about a year and a half. So very few Canadians have it. And so we're not quite there yet. We're not quite at a point where we can say, well, this will happen to insurance and this won't happen to insurance. It's burgeoning. It's just growing now. So it's hard to say. But
the industry is the industry saying you should make these buildings more flood-proof, or is the industry saying to the decision makers, the legislatures, you should be thinking twice about letting people even build there?
Right. That's the first thing. We're saying that we shouldn't be there in the first place, particularly in that 1 in 20. That's the floodplain that can flood very regularly. And when you're out on the fringe of the 1 in 100, then you can start talking about things like building more resiliently so that when the flood comes, you don't have the damage that you would otherwise have had.
Steve, Conrad, you had started to talk about a few things that can mitigate some of this. What are rain gardens?
Oh, well, rain gardens are essentially green spaces that collect and absorb water, allow it to percolate into groundwater systems at a slower rate rather than sort of flush that water away. So historically, we designed stormwater systems to try and get rid of the water, get it out of the city as fast as possible, and then that sort of increases this water flow for downstream communities. But there's a number of ways that communities can slow that down so that the impact of rain events, are mitigated.
So am I right in understanding the more development we have, the more things we pave, the more things we build on, that's what we're doing. We're messing with the ability to absorb that water, and we have to think about building differently then?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a single roof, it's startling to see how much water that roof can collect and push into our systems, whereas if you were to replace that roof with a green roof, for example, you would slow that down and it would percolate more in a natural flow.
And what else can you do?
Well, I guess there's a number of things to do. I think, just to throw out a sort of a secondary thought, it's all good to think that we'll sort of retreat from these flood areas, but ultimately I think people are going to want to build in these communities, build in these areas that are high value. And so, communities are going to find themselves sort of in the climate change adaptation world, whether they think they are, just because I think development will continue along these in these high value corridors. But, we see a number of ways that we can mitigate that. If you look to Copenhagen, for example, within their urban development plan, they actually have water buffers and water storage areas to mitigate the very extreme rain events that they have. And so they may use dual service, like a skate park, that is a skate park one day and the next day it's a water reservoir. Or, rather than having just a paved corridor down the middle of the street, you actually have a green area through the middle of the street that can help absorb that water.
Now, you have a degree in psychology. I'm intrigued how you put that to work on this issue.
Well, one of the things I look at is people's willingness to pay for some of this infrastructure investment. And so the willingness to pay for things is very fascinating to me. And one example is, I work within the water sector, and so the average cost of water here in BC is something like 0.00063 cents for a liter of water from the tap. But, people are willing to pay, $3.50 for a liter of a bottle of water from a store. So that's close to 5,000 times more than what they would pay at home. So how could we, capture that willingness to pay for these types of valuable services and turn it around and invest in infrastructure?
Jeannine, what you're talking about, too, is political will to actually to take control of some of these big things that have to, like flood maps, like the watershed.
Yes, I am.
What about the psychology of that?
What I'm hoping is as an aftermath of all of the floods and all of the misery that we're seeing now is that people will start thinking and having this discussion. I think there's a good chance, and all of my colleagues think there's a good chance, and that's why we're on the air talking to people, trying to say, hey, we have to start thinking about these things.
So even as people buy or build houses or think about where they might live, they need to think about floodplains.
But they need that information, and we have to be getting that information freely available on a website that you don't have to pay $111, as it is the case now for the few floodplain maps that there are. That has to be up on an easy-to-use website for every citizen to look at.
Glenn McGillivray, what do you want to add?
I would agree with that. There's one Eastern European country where you can enter your postal code into a website and find out your risk, and that's the type of thing that we need. Unfortunately, this data is not really forthcoming to us as researchers, let alone to homeowners. And homeowners wouldn't understand a flood map. It's not really fair to lay that on them and say, here, read this and interpret it. Another thing I think we have to do is get it into the deal when you're buying a home early on in the deal, so that you can make an informed decision. Is this home at risk? Yes, no. At what risk? And then the home buyer can make a decision. Right now, there's something like that in Ontario. It's completely voluntary, and it's my understanding that it comes just as the keys are being handed over to you and the final papers are being signed when it's too late. So we really have to get on top of these things. It's not hard. I think we often hear this thing that, if I'm designated in a floodplain, my property value is going down. The research on that is really split. It's not really clear that that's the case, and so we can't use that as a driver.
We have to leave it there. Thank you, all of you, for weighing in on this. Appreciate your thoughts. That is Jeannine St-Jacques. She's a climatologist and a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia University in Montreal. She joined us from Quebec City. Glenn McGillivray is Managing Director at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. He's in Toronto. Steve Conrad is an adjunct professor at the University of BC. He joined us from Vancouver.